Hello! Thanks for joining once again. The Four Seasons, What Lies Beneath. This is our fourth day, can you believe it? 4 out of 5. So thanks so much for being here again. Thought we'd try to start basically on time and then have everyone connected up right in the beginning for a change. I've learned a thing or two over the last couple days of how all these places like to get the wires connected. So thank you for coming back. Great to spend this time with you. We're going to look at winter today. I even thought I look a little bluish in the picture, so maybe that's appropriate for a winter's night here. Quick reminder that if you haven't yet downloaded my marked parts so that we can be playing from the same page and workbook for this week, go ahead and do that. There's a link in the Facebook description, a link in the YouTube description. Just tell me where to send it. You can do that right now and you should get an email soon with those materials for you. Remember, this is all leading toward tomorrow, where we're going to, simultaneously play the slow movement of winter together. I'll even play it too live, and you can, if you're playing, you can mute me. But the idea is that by the time that comes, so it'll be about 24 hours from now, we'll have in our minds the kind of performance we want to give, and we'll have the tools to do it. Now, it may seem like a compressed time frame, and it is, but this is all to get used to the process, right, of preparing not just bowings and fingerings, but preparing a whole mindset and at least unearthing some of the fundamentals that will get us that performance that we want, and then imagining, what could be possible on that longer time frame and with even more musical material. As always, I'll leave some time for your questions at the end. Those of you who are here live, make sure you put those in the chat, or you can hold off on them until closer to that time. And then, like the other days, be sharing a couple performance clips with you to see, in my own plan, what came off according to plan, what didn't, and what can I change about my process for next time. So winter. This is so evocative, right? In the beginning, we've got the ice and the snow, everybody shivering a little. And to do that, we've got all these trills. Now, it's interesting, a lot of times Vivaldi would mark something like a trill or a slur or whatever, and then say segue or simile to keep doing it. Here he doesn't do that, and just, this is little trivia for you in case you're playing it with orchestra coming up. We elected to have the tutti players do as marked, so 1 bar of trills, but me taking the solo part, I elected to keep the trills, just a little way to stand out even further. And these trills, by the way, just little turns. They're kind of like little shivers, and Ponticello gives the icy sound, right? This is actually a great thing to practice even if you're not playing winter. Why do I say that? It's to build the quick timing, not only in the left hand, just to do a simple turn, right? That action, so essential for all playing. You're really rehearsing the lift even more than the drop. The drop, or the falling, is a passive action. The lift is the active action, right? So I love practicing turns with all 4 fingers, right? Let me get rid of Ponticello for now. So between an open string and a 1, I'm using a longer bow for now. Or And I say all fingers, of course, because we use all 4 fingers and we need to be able to turn and trill with all of them. The ability to do a little drop and lift is the basis of a great trill. I have YouTube videos on trill workouts. What happens, the difference when you're doing a single drop though, or a single turn, is that it has to be synced up even more closely with the bow. So that little bite, what am I doing? I'm setting a little bit of weight into the string, and if I'm in the upper half of the bow, as I am now, I can tell about how much weight I'm setting in by how much that stick moves toward the hair. So no weight at all, it's not moving at all toward the hair. As I push my thumb up into the leather of the bow, the stick moves closer and closer. If I set maximum weight, that stick's gonna touch the hair. By the way, this is a nice, for everybody wondering how tight their bow should be, just put it at the tip, straight bow at the tip, and start adding weight. That means pushing the thumb up into the leather, means a slight pronation here. Of course, it doesn't mean getting the arm up high and trying to press down. We don't do that, we rotate instead. Now I'm noticing, at least in this room that I'm in now, I actually can't get the stick to touch the hair. I would have to add so much weight. So that means, at least for this bow stick and in this humidity, temperature, whatever, I'm a little too tight. Let me try it again. I've loosened it. And now I can just barely get that stick to touch the hair with a lot of weight in there. That's just about perfect. So once again, moderate upper half. By the way, this doesn't work if you're at the frog. You go ahead and try. You can put as much weight as you want. That hair is never going to touch the stick unless your bow is really, really loose or something. That's because the hair and the stick give differently in different parts of the bow. So you put it at the tip to test. So I can set with a little bit of weight here. And I release that weight at the same time as I draw the bow. If I release it too soon, if I release it completely before I move the bow, then I get no consonant at all. If I release it too late, the bow drags, right? And I get a that's not even a consonant, that's a cough. But if I release it just right, it should feel a little bit like a pizzicato. This is called a well, you can call it a colle if it's especially short, martelé, basically. You can see that bow stick really going down and springing back up. Now, if it's an exceptionally short and fast bow, one after another, that's what I'm doing here. And that's what needs to be synced up with the left hand, right? If I wanted to, I could do it repeatedly in one direction. It's all the same stroke, it's just which direction I'm releasing. Ponticello. And if you do it really fast, you get some kind of up-bow staccato. Topic for another day, but for me to do the really fast up-bow staccato, I do something a little bit different. And just in case you were curious, I tighten my whole arm and then just push it up. Except I like it more even than that. I'm not going to be doing that in this piece. So now we get the winter wind. I'm no longer Ponticello. This is at letter A. talked yesterday in autumn about this idea of, what are these really? They're octave scales, descending octave scales. We had that, let's just find the place, in autumn. That was in the first movement, bar 36. Talk about how easy these could be if you think in terms of peeling the fingers away. So here the pattern is not the same on the two strings. I've got to move my two up, right? Remember this, because with a loose hand, it's really easy and it comes off very well. Not exactly what happened in my performance, so you're going to see that in a second. Next. These passages are great because it's arpeggios and scales together. This is a little bit of a trickier one, right? Because I've got to move the 4 up, I've got to move the 1 back. So it's a compressed hand here. More open hand. You don't get a better demonstration of the power of hand frame than this, really. Because someone who doesn't have a very stable hand frame, it's going to be really hard for them to play this in tune, because they're going to want to move their hand up for that higher 4, and then back for the low 1. The definition of hand frame is the hand stays in one place. That's in theory anyway. That's just moving the 3 up. So, this is the last of the 4 seasons, right? And, you know, I was pretty jazzed up for this this performance, and I mentioned how in the beginning of the seasons, adrenaline, you know, that's kicking in, and that presents its own dangers, its own issues. Well, by the end of a nearly 40-minute set, there's a little bit the opposite problem where there can be. Might be getting a little stiff. You know, also the temperatures, it's certainly comfortable enough at the Hollywood Bowl, but it's dropping. And I'm just, you know, a little tired. As much as I, you know, worked to get my stamina up in the weeks and months leading into this, and look, let's face it, it's not the Tchaikovsky concerto or the Elgar concerto or the Brahms concerto. But don't underestimate the 4 seasons either for stamina stuff. So as much as I worked for that, I was a little bit tired, a little bit stiff, I would say, in the hand when it came to some of the moving things. And nothing catastrophic, but you'll hear that the notes didn't come out. Particularly my 3, I can remember from the performance, but the 3 and the 2, the middle fingers, they didn't want to relax and lie down like that. They wanted to kind of come in and stay upright. So as I share the clip, you'll see that again. The frame was there, but the fingers within the frame weren't always behaving exactly. So let me find, this is actually going to be from the beginning, but I will skip some of that. I will make sure that sound is on. It appears it is. Skipping to get past the Good, we'll pause there. If I'm proud of myself for one thing, I didn't panic, as far as the hand tiredness went. I mean, I knew what was happening, and I just figured I took it a little bit easy in the tutti stuff that came right after that. Just saved my arms a little bit, and I was able to remember what was going to work for me for the. It's interesting, it's all the same stuff, isn't it? It's a little bit easier going up. I changed some bowings there, really just for variety. It's interesting, in the Haydn string quartets, so many of them are practically concertos for the first violin, and there will be pages of separate fast notes, and it's inconceivable that he would expect someone to just play them all that way. When you look at the kind of variety he would sometimes write into those quartet parts, I have to think it's just not, rather than being laziness, it was an expectation that, well, the performer's going to do what they want here. I don't want to limit them by spelling out exactly what fun stuff they could do. But it's worth, on a page like this, and here, of course, I'm just before letter E in this first movement of Winter, worth thinking of what some other options could have been. He goes ahead and writes in. So separate, slurs of 2, and then, why not slurs of 4 when they're grouped in 4s? So it's really up to you to decide what effect is going to come out. So at 32, I did it once separate, and then once. Those could be slurs of 2, right? It's a little harder, I think. The downside, let's say this were some other kind of music, the downside of a 1 plus 3, what's a potential downside? Well, you've got uneven bows, right? So there's a danger of accents on the down bows, especially if you're doing down for the 1. I wasn't concerned about that because I didn't mind the bum, 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 bum. It matches that kind of motif from the beginning of the movement. So let's look, by the way, if we back up that tutti right before C. I'm thinking of the energy right from the first quick note. And I actually just do that from the air. I'm not trying to sustain an even sound, because to do so I'd have to put more weight into the string. And this works best, I want this fast. So I don't mind that percussive. It just lets me throw the bow a little bit and release the tension, so the arm doesn't get tired. Look at letter H. This is literally the chattering of teeth. And there's actually a note as far as performing this, because even though it's written as double stops, now first, of course, you want to just practice the double stops. playing with these suspensions there. But then as far as the chattering, definitely off the string, but it works nicely if you see me doing this with my arm, it's just to let it move so that I'm not stuck in one static place. Generally, the faster off the string strokes go, the higher in the bow. So something like this where it's really fast and I don't mind a really percussive sound, I could be quite high in the bow. So that's, that's a particular special effect in this one. And then we finish with just more of the... That takes us to the slow movement, which, let's come back to that. But you know what, let's do it in order, because actually it happens to be part of the same video clip. Someone very nicely took a long video clip of this that included the first and second movements. So I'll let you see, I'll just play my performance of the slow movement. It's not very long. And we've talked shapes, macro and micro shapes, talked a little bit about bowings and note grouping. So now, by watching the choices I made, I think that'll answer some of the fingering questions. If you have some at the end that I don't talk about now, just save those. I'll come back to them. But rather than finger numbers, I encourage you to look at where string changes are. Okay, because that's more important. I mean, nobody knows or cares, unless they're a student of the violin, what actual finger is going down. But they might very well notice when string changes are taking place, as we talked about yesterday. So let me cut back there and find that second movement. All right. Switch back. So I will go ahead and play that live tomorrow. That way we can I'll be doing it at the same time. As I said, you can mute me if you're playing along. I'll give you time to finish. That's funny. I could have sworn that I'd kicked this habit of letting my finger, my first finger, go out on these bow changes. Not a huge deal. I just don't like how it looks, and it's not doing anything for me. So. Funny to see it there. So I guess that's one of the reasons we have video. It just makes it all the more astonishing, the standard that, you know, some of the great soloists from 100 years ago could reach, hardly ever having the chance to listen back to themselves or to see themselves. I mean, they could see in a mirror, but not to be able to see footage of them performing. It was that much more difficult. You know, when you've got recordings of other people to kind of inspire you and kick you along, it's easier to motivate yourself to improve. Although they did have, you know, performance recordings back then, you can bet that those who hadn't gotten to hear Heifetz live when he started performing in the US in 1917, his first recordings were released not long after that. I mean, it was within 2 months that RCA had him over to their studio in New York to record basically every piece he could play. At that point, it was something like, I don't know, 40 short pieces. You know, those records were limited to four minutes or something aside. So, you know, Zigeunerweisen, like a cut-down version of Zigeunerweisen, I think took up 2 sides of a 78 RPM record. But all the rest were 4 minutes or less. You can bet every other violinist was buying those records to check out the competition, and I wonder if they could believe what they were hearing, especially once they knew it was a 16-year-old boy. Anyway, it's good to watch yourself, not only in the mirror as you practice, but to see what actually happens in performance, because some weird old habits can reemerge, and those are just things you know you need to focus on for next time. It's one of the main reasons, by the way, that it can be so disappointing if you only focus on the negatives. Performance can be so disappointing if you're not ready for the fact that different behaviors can emerge under pressure when you have other things you're focusing on. That's so much a part of the mindset training, right? Is to be able to listen for different things all at once. And your priorities might change as you go forward in the performance preparation process, PPP. You know, in the beginning, you may be listening, gearing your ears even more toward intonation, sound quality, just making sure that everything's very clean. Still, I hope you don't neglect shaping. I hope you don't neglect listening for that and for the flow of the rhythms and all that. As time goes by and you've given yourself more and more repetitions with the notes just in the right place, maybe you shift even more toward listening for the exact shape, those macro and even the micro shapes, the different qualities of your vibrato. The trick is, though, that you can never stop listening for pitch and sound quality. And this is where a lot of performances or performers can go wrong. If you think that you did all that work in the early stages and now you can just speed things up and trust that the pitches are all going to stay the same and the quality is all going to be there. I wish it worked like that. But at every speed and with every shape, you have to keep an ear out for pitch, have to keep an ear out for quality. And that's why some people will be disappointed. They'll say, I did all this work, all this slow work in the practice room for months, and then on stage, it all went away. And that's simplifying things too much. you could have played it slowly on stage, perfectly in tune. Instead, you played it at tempo, and you probably played it very much like it was in the practice room, with some old habits thrown in that only happen to emerge, when the pressure's on. So I've shared with you some of what those were in this performance. As I said, I don't want to downplay the advantages that I had going into this. I had ample preparation time. I gave myself, I had a year if I wanted it, but I took the 3 months before. I had performed 2 out of these 4 seasons before from memory, albeit decades before. And, I started from the standpoint of being in sound shape in terms of things like the ascending and descending scales that we've talked about, the arpeggios, the double stops. So with those things in place, I didn't need to spend very much of those 3 months learning those skills. They were in there, but they had to be incorporated right into this material. And they had to, with great tools come great responsibility, right? You want to use them for shaping. Just a couple fingering choices that we hadn't gone over yet. Both in the beginning and at K, right? I'm playing those on the A string. So I chose 2-4. At K it was 1-3. The difference between the A and the D string on most violins is usually not as big as the difference between E and A. Usually the E string should be the real outlier. That's our soprano voice, our brilliant voice. So of all the string changes, you want to be most on the lookout about when you change to or away from the E string. On my instrument, for example, and on many people's instruments, the E will be a heavy gauge E for a lot of power, a lot of brilliance, and I don't mind that the A sounds, duller or more muted in comparison. It has to. I don't aim for an even sound on all the 4 strings. So here at K, I don't mind that string change at all, whereas I would have minded that one. So, by the way, open strings, although I'm certainly, everyone can see I'm not playing in a sort of historically informed, or at least a strict historically informed. I hope I'm informed a little bit, but I'm not getting rid of vibrato or any of that. So I use open strings, but I want to be listening to the notes surrounding, right? In this case, the notes before are relatively quick, so my vibrato is probably not going to stand out. But here, if I went from open to a ton of vibrato, that would be a little shocking. So I use open strings. Sometimes they're an essential part of the effect, but I'll use them melodically as well, as long as I'm paying attention to what surrounds them. Here, I did go ahead and change to the E. Partly to be different from the beginning. In the beginning, I did a 4th finger trill, but it was on the A string. Here's the same notes. So I change to the E string, we're in a more intense part of the movement, and it also just kind of helps me remember this is one of those inflection points, right, where you could go one way or the other way. And just for memory purposes, sometimes I like changing a fingering to signal this is the second time. But I did also have that musical reason. There too, I decided against keeping it all on the A string. I thought I want the brilliance by the time I get to... So I needed a place. As long as it's not just one note on the E string, then I didn't mind the change. One's on the E. One's on the A. To practice that shift, by the way, it's an old finger shift, right? I'm not doing... That's not a Vivaldi shift, is it? So that's how I practice it. Then later and later. Finally, so late, and I've stopped the bow for just a smidge, that it's almost inaudible. But you still hear a little bit, which I don't mind. If I want it totally clean, then I would just change fingering. I'd do something like... But I like a little... Then back to E. So that's part of my fingering thought process for that. Again, more about strings than it is about numbers. And if this were a piece in the Romantic era, I would want to select my fingerings based on strings and glissandi, slides, before filling in numbers. So if you see me sketching out a preliminary fingering plan, it's true. Sometimes I'll do it just by getting my hands on it, trying some things that strike me. But more and more I like to say, you know, before I actually play it, where do I hear the slides here? Let me mark some likely places. Where are some places that I really want to be on a certain string, or places that I definitely want to change sounds? Let me mark those, and then see what numbers suggest themselves. It's a very creative way to go about picking fingerings, as opposed to a utilitarian way where you find something that works and then sort of change it if something better occurs to you. You can get to the same place both ways, but I find if I start utilitarian, I often end that way too. Look at the third movement. Here we've got 4 bars of slurs and then segue. So that's a place where he's, right, just didn't want to write all those extra slurs and waste the ink, I guess. Ink was expensive back then, probably. In my performance of this, I cycle in and out of Ponticello. So that's just, of course, a contact point thing. It's a great exercise to do, even if you're not playing a piece with special effects. You know, if you're playing... in the Brahms concerto, when you're selecting your contact point, to change it around. Too close, too far. Here I do it for special effect, of course. At N, these dots, I don't take them as off the string because I don't feel like the character demands it there. I'm putting more weight into the string, but I'm not stopping the bow. It wouldn't be wrong if you know, on a modern bow, if you thought you could better get that effect. But then I'd keep it really close to the hand rather than... And then I change it up. For the series there. You can see it. Oh, I just think this is yeah, dangerous steps on the ice. By the way, the point where you fall in is right before Q. And then a complete change of character. Interesting that there's not a dynamic change marked there. Clearly there has to be. So just remember, these scores aren't infallible. And then finally, from R to the end is the big finish. I will play you that clip. I was happy that I had enough left in the tank to still play fast at the end. And truthfully, it's not the hardest part of everything. If you can get a good start, this is at R. By a good start, I mean that you're not carrying tension when you set the bow on the string. You know, if you see all this engaging when you set the bow on the string, then you're likely, you know, it's either going to be slow and stiff or even crunchy. So to get the bow set and then just almost as if you were going to release the bow off the string. So that clip I'll play, and I think this camera person actually got sort of creative, and it's nice. They let you see some of the moon and stars and all that. So this is be the end of the winter, I believe, from Q. Yeah. So at the end of all these movements, there's always the question, do you want to do one of these big pauses? Yeah. And if so, is there going to be a retard before, or is it no retard and a pause? Some people do it in every movement. My idea was, okay, all these movements that just end with fast notes into the end, it's gonna be a train going straight to it. And then in the performance, right as we were approaching the end, I realized, well, I said that for this other movement, I think it was Summer, that ends in a similar fashion. I said we were going to go straight through, but I don't remember if we talked about, the fact that we should do the same thing in this movement. So right when we get there, I can feel half the orchestra making a little retard, half not. And then half the orchestra making a little break and half not. And even I second guessed, so I made a little break. So the last note wasn't together. If this were a recording, we'd just do another take. But that's, with one rehearsal, that's you gotta live with those things. Take a risk. To be honest, I even took the liberty of saying, particularly because these were my colleagues and they all knew me, I rarely like when a soloist makes a speech to an orchestra, but I allowed myself a small one because it was the only rehearsal and because I knew them. I just said I would rather have everyone shape and take a guess at which direction things are going, and I'd rather have us be wrong occasionally than kind of always be waiting for one another and try to get everything exactly together. This is the only rehearsal, so let's just have fun and use our instincts and take a risk. And I did feel like that happened. I felt that freedom on stage. So that's the end of the Four Seasons, the end of that performance, and I'm happy to give any general reflections that you want to ask about, but I think we've done that over these 4 days. As I look to see what questions of yours might come in, I just want to turn your thoughts once more toward tomorrow. And while I do, could we take out the workbook and just review your pages of prompts? Because by the end of today, I hope you will have filled out all 3 of them. And then in the margins, because I don't think I left enough space for that, I'd love for you to write a little bit about what's going to happen tomorrow. So remember, we've got mindset. That's how you expect to succeed on stage and in the practice room. Remember that success can have different definitions. It's not always, well, I hope your idea of success is not playing every note perfectly, because then you will always fail. Right? It could be that your listeners get the musical message. They really enjoy the music as it was written by the composer, but especially as it was played by you. They enjoy having shared that time with you. Your tools are the skills and the studies, perhaps, that build and maintain those skills. And the techniques are the practice techniques, the minute to minute, the day to day. What do you do with the violin in order to prepare your mind and body for the stage? So mindset we filled out a few days ago, and if you haven't, you got a little catching up to do. It won't take you long. Tools, that was a day or two ago. Thinking back to your last live performance. And finally, practice techniques. And this you may not have filled in yet. So if you haven't, I invite you to do that either now as we're talking or later today. So again, this is thinking back to your last live or your last significant live performance. First of all, did you prepare any differently for that one than before? Were there special things you tried? Maybe you devoted more of your time to slow practice. Maybe you just put in more hours or fewer. Maybe you took more breaks. Maybe you started every day with scales, which you hadn't done before. Maybe you threw in some etudes. Maybe it was as simple as when you made a correction, you repeated it 5, 7, 10 times rather than going right on. Or, maybe it's maybe you did some different things that you realize weren't so beneficial. That's happened to me where I have a performance and I'm like, what happened there? I felt like I'd prepared a lot, felt like I'd prepared well. Let me compare that to this other time where I really felt great. That time I played it in front of people for like 3 times over the 2 weeks before the performance. This time I didn't try it out ever. Maybe that was it. How often did you imagine the final performance as you practiced? And I'm hoping to convince you through this week and this process that it should be a daily occurrence, that you always have that final thing in mind. Just to say another word about that, one of my favorite books, because photography was and is a hobby of mine, Ansel Adams, famous name, but if you're not super familiar with his work process and kind of his philosophy and how he made his photos, everybody's seen an Ansel Adams photo, but if it just sort of seems like a vague black and white cool nature thing, there's a lot more to it. And my favorite book of his is called The Making of 40 Photographs, or The Making of 40 Prints. No, I forgot. But he was persistent. He was meticulous. He really loved the craft. Back then, of course, you couldn't snap a photo and see it right away. There were 3 major stages to making a print that someone could see. There was the exposure, right? You're there, you expose the film, which in those days meant either you take out the dark slide and put it back in a few seconds later, or if it's a faster exposure, you had a mechanical shutter. So there's the exposure, and then you've got to protect that glass plate, whatever it is. No light can touch it until the processing. And that's where in a dark room or a dark bag, the film gets processed with the developing or the processing chemicals. You get to make choices about what those chemicals are and how long it sits in there, how it's rinsed off. And then making the print, where generally you're enlarging the plate. If it's a print that's the exact same size as the plate, he would use either 4x5 plates or 8x10 plates. Maybe if it's the same size, then it's called a contact print. The plate just sits on the paper and the light shines through it. If it's enlarged, which it usually was, then you need the holder. So each of those 3 stages is essential. You can't have a print without it. And he considered his print to be basically the performance. So just him now the hard work you would think would be hiking up to Half Dome in Yosemite or something and being there and choosing the right settings, taking the picture. But for him, the print and someone viewing the print in a gallery or wherever, that was his performance. And everything had to lead to that. And in fact, he would always, and he repeats this throughout the book, it doesn't matter how beautiful the scenery is when he's there. Oh, this would make a great picture. He had the final print in mind as he set up the camera, because things look different in 2 dimensions than they do in 3. They look different in black and white than they do in color. He had the final print in mind as he was making all his decisions in the exposure, the processing, and finally the printing process. I found that very interesting. And for him, he hated this idea of, well, let me just take 20 versions of this, and then I'll figure out later which one is good. And I can just compare all the prints and throw out the ones I don't like. He had a very specific final image in mind, and he would make sure to get it. So, great questions. I don't know if it's Tara or Terry Lee. Those trills in the beginning of winter, yeah, they're starting on the main note and going up above. Exactly. I suppose that's partly just tradition. Darlene, you ask, how much playing would I typically do on the day of the performance so that I have enough energy? Yeah, that is something you've got to figure out. Each person has to figure out for themselves, right? Because some people do best when they're super fresh. I tend to be a little bit the opposite way. I mean, I don't want to exhaust myself, but I want to feel well played out. Or well played, I guess, would be a better expression. It takes a lot for me to get tired. I mean, I think I shared with you the one place that I could really feel it, but it doesn't usually happen too often. And I would rather risk that than feel kind of edgy, like I hadn't been in contact with the instrument enough. So especially if I have an audition earlier in the day or a performance earlier in the day, I like to get going on the earlier side so that I can get a couple hours in. Now, the kind of playing that I do, I don't want very much of it to be high intensity playing. So I'm not saying that I, run through the whole Four Seasons twice before I play it that night. I just want to be in contact with the instrument. I'll try out a few parts, but a lot of it will be slower, lower intensity. So on this day, I would imagine that I'd probably played some 3 hours over the course of the day. Well, the rehearsal was an hour and 15 minutes that morning, and then I probably did 2 other hours of playing before the performance. That said, you have to work up that stamina, right? If you're only used to playing a total of 2 hours in a day, you don't want to play for 3 on performance day and then perform. You're not used to that. So Melinda asks, do I ever record myself practicing to check in and see how I'm doing? Is there a particular way you'd recommend using that? That's a big topic. The answer is yes, definitely. I record myself all the time. When I was growing up and it was harder to record oneself with any sort of quality, I didn't do as often, and when I did, it tended to be like an entire movement. Let me record a whole movement and see how it sounds. Well, that's hard to listen back to. I don't love... I realize the value in this process that I'm going through with you, reviewing my own performance clips. It's immensely valuable. I don't like doing it exactly, because I'm like most people. I don't like seeing myself play. I see so many things wrong. But I did that growing up. It was hard to want to listen back to a whole movement. So what I do now much more often is just, let me record 8 bars. So like that part before, let me just record that right out of the gate. See how that's sounding. What's happening? Am I hearing in playback exactly what I'm hearing as I play? Because if I am, then that's a good indication I'm fully aware, and that I'll be able to self-diagnose. If what I hear on the recording shocks me, then it's like, not only, I want to fix the problems that I'm hearing, but more importantly, what's different about my listening? I shouldn't be shocked when I hear a recording. I might have an unpleasant surprise, but it shouldn't sound completely different than I expect. So that's more how I do it now, but that's a big topic that I'm going to talk some more about in the coming months. And Charlotte, do I adjust bowing to make different strings sound more similar? Yeah, I suppose the most common ways in which I do that, if I'm playing something where I have to change, let's say, from A to E string, just because otherwise the fingering would get ridiculous. But it's part of the same line and I don't want to, then what I might do is to be sure and have a contact point on the E string that's further away. Usually on the E string you'd get closer to the bridge, but maybe I'll do the opposite. so that it's not quite as bright on the E string, and then the reverse, something like that. And just most of it, I think, is about being aware of how much pressure you need on the different strings. A lot of folks just have the opposite idea. On the E string, they're pressing more. As they shift to higher positions, they're pressing more, and it needs to be the opposite. Julie, why didn't I put more ornaments into the largo? Yeah, you know, here I'll just say it's an area of performing where I have less confidence than some other areas. I mean, it's a little bit of a, I don't know if loaded question is the right word, but in other words, your taste would have been for more ornamentation. And it is a continuum, right? I mean, there's always going to be a point where everybody would say, "Yikes! What was that? That was just all over the place. It took away from the beauty or the simplicity." And I know that's not what you want. So you felt I could have gone further because I barely put any ornamentation in there. Yeah, it was, I think, just a lack of clarity in my own imagination as to what would enhance the line rather than taking away from it. So that's one regret I have about not getting a series to play around with. Because if I'd had 4 performances of this, not only would that have been more chances, of course, to try more things, but I would have had that feeling of safety, like, yeah, sure, I can take big risks now because I've got other performances. One mental trick I think that we all need to practice is pretending like we have that freedom to take risks, even if we've only got one performance, as so many times we only do. If you can always believe that there's room for experimentation, even on stage, you're going to enjoy performing more. And that can be hard to do. There's always that desire for control, right, and safety. And I think that's part of what was playing into my conservative approach, to the ornamentation there. Joanna asks about how many times a day do I do visualization, for how many days before the performance. So when I mentioned earlier that having the final performance in mind should be a daily occurrence, that means I do a little bit of visualization every day. I should probably still do more. But as the performance gets closer, I do more. I would say it's probably, 5 times a day or so, because I do find it mentally quite tiring. Probably 5 times a day in the few weeks leading up to a performance or an audition. And without going into all the details, what it basically means is that without moving my hands and moving my fingers, I'm seeing without my eyes, I'm hearing without my ears, feeling without my body, what is happening. So, how am I feeling or seeing or hearing what's happening when nothing is happening? Well, that's the visualization. And if you've never tried it, you might assume that, well, there's no trick or benefit to that at all, because anybody can just imagine a perfect performance. Try it sometime. If you think it's easy to do, it's usually not so easy for you to not just imagine, but to actually see, feel, and hear yourself playing exactly the way you had drawn it up. Usually doesn't happen that way, even in your own imagination. And so by practicing that visualization, you can reveal some hidden tendencies, and you can head them off before you ever get to the stage. Visualization has revealed all kinds of strange things to me, and sometimes it'll take me a year or more to figure out, where was that strange thought coming from? Like, why did my fingers suddenly start flopping around in that passage when I visualized it? And then later it'll hit me, that's because I had this tendency that only comes out when I'm on stage and all the focus, all the pressure's on. And Luke ask, how do I manage whether the trills are from the top or the bottom, solely based on whether it's an appoggiatura or not? Well, so in this case, the chords were really built on these notes. So and they were just going to be turns. So I wanted the notes to have primacy and just little decorations. As far as trills in general, whether they're from above or below, that, the explanation I like best about that was in a book that a former colleague of mine wrote. The former principal bassoon of the Chicago Symphony, David McGill, wrote a book called, I believe it was called Sound in Motion. And he has a whole section on this, and I think some really good arguments about how and why and when. But anybody who says, oh, Baroque music, it's always from above, that's just, there are no blanket statements like that. I think it's more often from above, but it has to do with where you're coming from and where you're going. So in the very beginning of spring, I see we're going down after the trill. So I'm going to do the trill from above. So that's just when I try to see if in bars 24, again, there, I really want people to focus on the main note. So I'm doing it from the main note, and I'm not ending up, it's just a note that stands alone, so I'm doing the trill from the note. So different people might have different opinions on that. And then Robert asks, does performing a solo at a venue like the Hollywood Bowl give me confidence for doing again? If I played 3-4 times in a row, would I start to feel more comfortable with each performance? I would say almost undoubtedly yes. In my life, I have rarely gotten to do the whole subscription series of a concerto. I've done it with some duo concertos like Bach Double, things like that. Once I did get to play the Brahms Concerto 3 nights in a row on a little mini tour after a competition, and there for sure. I mean, and that came after performing the whole thing in the finals of the competition itself. So it was like finals of the competition, super tight, nervous, no risks. Couple nights later was the first of 3 performances on this little tour, and it was like, the competition's over. I already got a prize. Now I can enjoy playing. It's like, hey, why didn't you tell yourself to enjoy playing in the finals of the competition? And then nights 2 and 3, it was like, I'll try anything now. So for sure, and this was another advantage I forgot to mention before, the Hollywood Bowl, I know what it looks like. I know that it's a really long walk to get onto that enormous stage. I know what it looks like to see thousands and thousands of people there. It doesn't make it automatic, but having been there before, yes, easier to do it again, for sure. What you can take from that, I think, is that if you can prepare a positive and successful mindset for your performances, then more performing generally equals more comfort in performing, which leads you to want to do it more and all of that. So, sorry, I thought I had all my beeping turned off. So tomorrow is our chance to wrap this all up, to put it not to the test, but to demonstrate to ourselves, where does this all lead for a short musical selection, short time frame? Is there anything different about performing this week and in this context? Having heard from me some about my process, having seen and heard where it leads, when it goes right, when it falls short. So your prompt for today, and this, I hope if you're up for sharing either on Facebook or in the comments here, your prompt is looking ahead to tomorrow with winter. We've got those 3 pages of the workbook, right? Now you don't have to, there are 3 prompts on every page. You don't have to answer 9 questions about Vivaldi Winter. But just one thought about mindset. What's your mindset going into tomorrow? You could make this, what do you want your mindset to be tomorrow while you're playing? Whatever's helpful in that regard. But remember, success has many definitions. I hope yours is not play every note perfectly, but I'd be interested to know what your mindset is or will be. Tools. Are there things that you recognized as we worked on the slow movement of winter? Things that you recognize that you, either you did practice them this week, like shifting, maybe it was vibrato, maybe string changes, a smooth détaché. You could also make this question, are there things you recognize now that we've worked on this? This is a little bit of a weakness, something I haven't explored much or haven't explored in a while. This is something I'm going to make a project the next couple weeks or this next month. And finally, techniques. If you have been practicing this a little bit in preparation for tomorrow, anything you've done differently based on what we've been talking about this week. You could also, a related question would be, are there any practice techniques I've talked about this week that really struck a chord with you, and you'd like to incorporate those in the future for pieces that you're playing? So that is your prompt about the slow move to winter for tomorrow. Mindset, tools, techniques. And I will see you back here, same time. It's going to be a fun and exciting day. So thanks for being here with me. See you tomorrow.